Thank you. Yeah, Dan Noble, Association of Compost Producers, State Chapter, California State Chapter of the U.S. Composting Council. One of the things that I haven't heard much of until this presentation were additives to soil in order to build healthy soil. So the manufactured products being mulch, compost, biofertilizers, and biochar made from residual, organic residual feedstocks, mainly green waste, food scraps, digestate, AD digestate, manure, and biosolids, which is basically wastewater AD digestate plus. And I'm wondering why that's the case. Is it because soil experts like soil NRCS or farmers are not using these materials, or there's a paucity of data about how these materials build healthy soil, particularly by adding extra organic carbon?
Okay, great. This sounds like a good Bianca question.
Yeah. It's indeed a very good question. If you look up our new fact sheet, one of the things we built into the biodiversity, the maximized diversity principle, is to include a diversity of inputs as appropriate. Because those are a component of many farming systems, not all of them. They can be, especially when they're either free or easily accessible, or there's lots of that around, or for small plots of land, there are a lot of situations where they are highly applicable and definitely very much help build soil health. And then there are other situations like rangeland where there are various issues with putting anything on, and there are, large acreages, 1,000 acres, and you're probably not going to spread compost on them in most cases. And so we're, at least from the NRCS perspective, it's not a principle in itself to add those inputs, but it is one of the various things that you can consider in terms of getting diversity into your system.
Okay. Yes.
My question relates to citizen science, and it could be fielded by SARE or OFRF or Jimmy NACD or NRCS, hopefully all, regarding what do you do with the data once you've got it, and how do you make it useful? I have a small consulting company, Soil Health Services, and managing data can be daunting for multiple farms, and I can imagine for individual farmers it can be daunting as well. So as we look at hoping to engage conservation districts with this work and research efforts with this work and farmers in monitoring their own soils, how do we network and work together towards that effort in making the data useful?
So Jimmy, thinking from your perspective on your own farm and also your leadership role from NACD, how do you go about thinking about how to make use of data being generated from on-farm research and so on?
Well, you are correct that it can be daunting, and we all face that from time to time. And for me, traveling a lot and being gone, it can be helpful, but it can also be cumbersome. And it's a challenge to try to balance that mix. As I talk to a lot of producers across the country, a lot of times time is their limiting factor. And we see that bigger producers that are managing multiple farms, maybe not doing the on-the-farm actual farming activity, do a better job of managing that data. When I'm home, we're extremely busy trying to catch up from me being gone. So I try to utilize time like here at night before things start to try to capture some of that. But that is a serious problem because we are in a time, and I'm asking Wayne and everybody else to help me with more data, but it's also like time management. You've got to manage that. And so part of what I hoped to relay a while ago was it doesn't take complicated data to make a big impact. If we can just show producers that it's economical, that it's building their soil, that they can not use all their water in the profile and understand the soil better. That doesn't have to be a 20-page document. Also, on far as farm records and tracking my soil health, I try to keep that to a minimum in documentation to look at, because if I'm trying to convert or relate to a producer out there, the worst thing I can do is lose him in the data while I'm talking. Producers are very, very visual and hands-on. But like most people, we have advanced, we have the middle of the road, and we have the guys that don't have a clue. So as you're talking to a group of producers, it's very challenging, because I get criticism sometimes because, well, we want more, you're too basic. But at the same meeting, well, could you make that more simpler where we can understand it? So it's very challenging in that.
Get to the bottom line. Yeah, that's the goal. Yep.
Well, I guess the comment I would add is thinking back to what I was saying about in the soil health space and in communicating and engaging, we have to be really careful not to skip over the trusted advisor as a engaged stakeholder, because in the fertilizer space, the retailers and the crop advisors every year on many farms and many customers they work with are doing on-farm trials. They're testing application rates, they're testing new products, they're testing different ways of applying those products and when they apply those products, and they do it through strip trials and efforts on the farm. And I think if we can educate the crop advisors of the value of cover crops and the products that were discussed that the first question brought up, like the other alternatives that are out there, bringing them into the on-farm trial space, you know, that's what they do, is manage the data of those strip trials. They do that for those farmers. And I think we have to use that as a potential opportunity in this space.
Good observation.
William Nelson, Ralph Morris Foundation. My question is addressed to the four of you, any of you, on the, are any of you doing any work with minority farmers, such as the black farmers in the South or First Nations? And just one example, First Nations Development Institute has a major initiative on food and agriculture on tribal land, and they've received several $1 million from large foundations and small, and then re-granted it. But we have a pretty homogeneous audience here today, and are we looking at new generations of producers? Hispanic in Minnesota, we have a growing Hmong population that's involved actively in farming.
So Diana, we'll start with you and then catch Bianca.
That is, in our research funding, the highest priority, and if you look at the RFP, we give different priority areas, and the highest priority is if the research is farmer-led, done on their farm, and also to minority serving individuals or minority farmers and ranchers, to socially disabled, you know, that the veterans. So we give priority to that because we want to enhance that. And in one of our surveys, in the North survey, we found that the South, there's a lot of difficulty in Southeast region. There's a lot of difficulties because of the climate, disease, and weed pressures there, particularly for the medium-sized farm and the small ranch farmers, which there's more in that area, that they don't have information that's to their level and to their understanding. So it's not only allowing them to have research opportunities to answer their questions and be done by them, as we've all mentioned before, but also then that can be translated at that scale into their needs, because their needs are very different, their challenges are different. And one thing we also try to provide funding for is the social economic challenges, which are different. So it's a different type of research at times.
Bianca?
Yeah, NRCS also has a number of efforts on that going on. One, we just announced our Conservation Innovation Grant awardees, and looking at disadvantaged populations is definitely one of the components for how we decide on who is awarded those, and so we have a number of awardees that fit that category. Also, our team, we have some agreements with a number of partners, and just one example is we're working with a group of 3 1890 schools. They are adapting our soil health curriculum for our training course to their program that they have. They're trying to build a soil health minor certificate program so that they can bring to their young disadvantaged groups that knowledge before they even make it into the working world. And so hopefully that'll have a good pool of new applicants to NRCS positions, partner positions that have anything to do with soil health. And I know here in New Mexico, Rudy Garcia, who's based here, does a lot of work with some of the tribal groups around here. So we have a lot of that going on around the country. A number of our specialists are working with those groups, and it's definitely an important piece of what we do.
Jimmy, you had a quick one on that?
Yeah, William, in Oklahoma, our Association of Conservation Districts that I'm president of has been really working with a lot of tribal projects this last year. We got a grant from FSA to reach out to help the tribes understand a little bit more about programs. We've also had a tribe that just became a conservation district, trying to understand more about that and how them owners can do a better job of managing their land and their soil. So there's lots of efforts going on, and we have a small minority conference in Oklahoma that we were part of. And so, yeah, there's lots of efforts going on, and yes, we can do a better job with that.
There's one over here. You got, oh, thank you. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Thinking about communication with producers, I think one of the things that we try to do with a soil health score or with this single metric is boiling it down and making it simple. And I think in this room we also probably all know that biology impacts all of the things that are going on, and soil health is about the function. So I'm wondering if you think that it might be beneficial for helping communicate with producers if we were able to make a metric that was specific, a cumulative score for nutrient cycling, and a cumulative score for water storage and delivery, and one for habitat, so that we could, and one for atmospheric regulation, these main soil functions that we think about. And that way, if a producer's main focus is that they only get 5 inches of rain a year and they need to figure that out, then they can maybe first get the set of metrics that would go towards their water storage and ability to deliver that. And then maybe somebody else is mostly concerned with their nutrient management. And so they go there, and that's kind of a gateway into getting more and more of these soil metrics. And whether or not that might be a way that we could communicate and kind of gateway in with some of these producers.
So Jimmy, why don't we start with you on that one, and then Bianca, I want to come over to you.
Yeah, I think that's a critical point. One of the things that we've had great success through social media is having peer groups across the country. I've assisted in numerous peer groups and follow different peer groups where farmers to farmers share enclosed media that they can ask them questions. And that's when we have a good opportunity to forward on documents like you're talking about to help that conversation and stimulate that in them groups. And yes, that would be a great benefit.
Bianca?
I would love for you to review the tech note when it comes out on the Federal Register. I think it addresses that to a certain extent, because what we did there is kind of define some processes that need to function appropriately for a soil to be healthy. So for example, for us to know, are the microbes active? Respiration is one way to get at that. It's imperfect, but it's a good one that is easily measurable. Diversity of microbes, there's still a lot to be figured out, but there's a measure in there for that. Aggregate stability, we all know that if your aggregates are falling apart, you're more likely to get crusting. That means you're less likely to get infiltration, and that would have a big impact on what's happening with water quantity. So that's kind of the approach. The idea is really that each indicator has meaning for a certain set of processes, and that helps you identify what the constraints are so that you can then target management specifically at what's wrong with your soil.
I would just add that anything that can be done to keep a complex topic simple is beneficial for communication. And in our experience in the nutrient stewardship space, fertilizer best management can mean a very vast landscape of actions, but right source, right rate, right time, right place is pretty simple for a lot of communities to understand and for us to start the conversation. So what you're proposing is, one way to simplify the many complexities that bring value and benefit to the soil health space, but give somebody a place to start. And I think that's, in communicating, that's so crucial.
Okay, we got one back here, and then we'll come over to the side. So in the back.
Question for Bianca. Bianca, you did a great job on your talk, by the way. In your talk, you highlighted or you emphasized the standardization. And I wonder if there's any ambivalence on your part in terms of standardization has a lot of problems. And I'm just wondering is there anything in your program that you're going to sort of address, making suboptimal measurements in some systems because everything's so highly standardized?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things. So what we're talking about standardizing is the standard operating procedure for how you measure a certain thing in the lab, not how you interpret it, right? So you measure something by the same method so that the number that comes out can be compared to the number that comes out of this lab, that lab, the other lab. There are programs for that for chemical testing.
Right, but again, the standardization lets you be interoperable, right? It lets you go from one place to the other. But I guess, for example, phosphorus. So you're not going to measure phosphorus the same in North Carolina as you do in Colorado, right?
Right.
Right.
And so
Okay,
there's another component to this. So this is going to be the current best available set.
Right.
And tech notes get reviewed periodically.
Right.
And so ARS reviewed this document. They have the research authority across a whole large a suite that NRCS doesn't. They will use that set of indicators plus everything else that's being researched. NIFA reviewed that document, has an interest in integrating that. So there are opportunities to use that as a minimum data set and to then add any other measures that are out there that folks are researching and compare them to this minimum data set. So we have a place to start comparing, but that doesn't mean that any other research is not valuable. Mm-hmm. It means that it has a great deal to add. There will probably be replacements of indicators as we move forward in time. There will be adjustments to indicators as things are improved. And of course, the interpretation of an indicator will depend on the soil and the climate in which it is measured. And that's a key important piece, is that when we standardize some aspect of how we do things, it gives us greater ability to adapt locally because we have more information to base that on.
Thank you.
All right, we have one over here.
Hi, this is Kurt Lawton. I'm with Corn and Soybean Digest magazine. And I was wondering, as you communicate with your various audiences, whether it's farmers, retailers, advisors, and you talk about soil health, what are they feeding back to you as far as aha moments that causes them to go down that road of further soil health?
Who wants to take a stab at that one?
I think that's been answered a couple of times, or at least the question is really coming down to economics and cost. I don't care what your system is or what you're doing or how you're doing it. And it doesn't matter if it's the small vegetable farmer in the South or the grain producers in the Midwest or whatever. From my experience with USDA and all the funding entities, we don't provide enough information about that and validate that these processes or this lab test can give you an economic boost. So I guess that would be, it's an aha moment in the sense we need more of this type of research data for validation.
Jimmy, what do you think? You thinking of your neighbors, what turns the light on for them? Maybe that's a different way to ask the same question.
Yeah, we see this across the country quite a bit. For instance, in weeds, there's, yeah, it's a big problem across the country. If we can ever get a producer to understand what a cover crop can do to suppression of weeds and leave a strip of nothing, I've had more and more people call and said, holy cow, I can't believe what this rye or what this cover crop has done to my weed suppression, and I've been fighting it, because most of the time, and we heard a lot of this past year or two, well, I'm going to have to go back to tillage to control these resistant weeds. And my answer is always, if tillage was the answer, we've had 200 years of that. And we still have weeds. So the big aha moment sometimes is just getting them to experience it and see it for themselves on their farm.
Yeah, well put.
And I would just add in the, in addition to what Diana said about cost as the aha moment, I think the other thing that follows with that is farmers, in our experience, want to see it and how it works on their farm. They want to hear a story or talk to a grower who is similar to them in their same region, in their same cropping system, farming in the same rotation. They want to be able to see themselves in that response so that they see themselves being able to do it the same way that it's being successfully implemented.
No, it applies to them. Yep, good observation. We got one here?
Hey, so my question has to do with communicating with farmers in fairly sort of traditional conservative kind of area. I think I've got a lot of things, unfortunately, working against me. That number one, I apparently look a lot younger than I actually am. So I think I get a lot of pushback from some of these older farmers when I try and communicate about changing approaches, challenges with soil, all of that. I just wondered if you all had any suggestions as to how to just open these conversations with older farmers, with the children of farmers who've been, country boys all their life. I don't have that background. I have a tech background, and now I'm farming. So people look at me as the newcomer on the block who's got all the good ideas, but in a way that's not, I should rephrase that, I don't necessarily have all the good ideas, but they look at me as if I'm coming in with this whole new set of information. And so it's very hard to build a community of people who can talk about this where I live. And that leaves me as a individual in a community that doesn't seem to be ready to move forward. So how do you all have any suggestions for how to approach people and communicate with people, sort of starting from that point?
Yeah, Jimmy might have a comment, but I'll just start on that one. So I find it helpful sometimes to just ask people about their own experience with farming, get them talking a little bit about how they've managed over the years. Have you ever tried something like this or run into a problem with that? And, getting them talking rather than just kind of lecturing on them on the need to change, which I'm sure you don't do. That really, if they start talking about their own experience, then I think that puts them in a reflective mood, which can then lead you to getting them to think a little bit about a new possibility. But Jimmy, how would you answer that?
Yeah, we see that all across the country, and you're absolutely right. Of course, your problem with looking too young, I'd like to hear that secret sometime. The biggest problem that I face when I talk to an older group of farmers is really if they're a traditional tillage farmer that's been very successful over the years, acquired lots of land and equipment, it's very hard for them to admit to themselves, much less to us, that I might have been wrong. I should have done something different. But yet they're very successful. And so that's very hard. A lot of times, if I can get to visit with the son or the grandson, typical thing in Montana last year, I put on a clinic. The local FFA advisor brought a class out. And just so happened she was a local gal that her dad still farmed, the advisor. And she said, I've been trying to get my dad to do all this, and he refuses to do it because I'm the child, and I don't have the experience. And I looked around a minute, I said, you have the perfect scenario right in front of us. And she said, what? And I said, get your class to ask your dad for a small plot of land to try something like this. He will do it for the kids, he won't do it for you. And I've had great rapport back, and guess what? It's a big success. So sometimes we have to find a route not so direct.
Yeah, good observation. Where's our mic on this side? Oh, we got a question in the back, then we'll come to the front, and I think there's one over here too. So, yeah, back there.
So Matt Bechtel, want to come back to the economic side and hit on a couple of points that we've heard today. So I'm going to go back to a great presentation we had today about machine learning and searching through literature. I mean, Google works because it's got massive amounts of data. Zillow works because it has massive amounts of data. The new TrueCar, so you can get a fair price on your car. In the world of ag right now, it's Farmers Business Network that's causing all kinds of potential grief for people. So you've talked about data centralization, data optimization, data interoperability. We've talked about getting these folks to try things. How do we incentivize them to make that next leap? Because what I'm hearing, and I'm going to commit a little bit of heresy is the concept of the perfect is the enemy of good. So from an economics perspective, here we are trying to find partial budgets, which every single person that sits on there talks about how difficult it is because of geographic diversity, crop management diversity. We face different things. So how do we get from convincing them to do trials to getting good enough data from enough people that we can actually do the kind of benchmarking we need to do to really push over the hump? Because without that massive amounts of data, how do we really, really make that massive impact on 300 million acres?
Well, so I'll tell you where we're starting, because in the economics component, we have struggled with this for several years. When we look at putting economic numbers on specific fertilizer best management practices, you end up thinking, oh, here's a pathway, and then you realize that there's so much variability from soil type to soil type, from rainfall season one year to dry season the next year, from hybrid changes across time. So there's so many variables that it becomes hard, at least in the fertilizer space, to identify the cost of implementation with any one particular practice or with any one effort. And to do a meta-analysis, or even if you had a large data set, there's so many variables that impact that, it becomes very hard very quickly. And so we've basically said, we're going to quit trying that approach, and we're going to build case studies of individual grower information. Now, we have a pathway to do that. Initially, we've got these 74 advocates that are across the country, from citrus in Florida to barley in Washington State, that we're going to build case studies to get some geographic diversity. In doing that, we're working with University of Kentucky and Kansas State right now to help us build out a template for data collection, so that we know what data we collect to build those case studies. And then for us, luckily, we have 50% of the 6,000 retail locations across the US, and we have a group of CEO executives that have committed to giving us some staff time in their shops to filling out that template and helping us collect those case studies. We're not going to achieve it anytime quickly. It's going to take time to build them, but we know we have to have that information, and that's the path that we feel like we can take. If somebody has a better suggestion or a better idea of how to do that, I'd love to hear it, because our thoughts on using meta-analysis or research to get to those answers, we haven't come up with a good path yet, but we think case studies are our best option.
We had one here. You don't have the mic, but I'll try to repeat your question. So you're good. Okay, sure. Go ahead.
Oh, that's okay. Thanks. I'll be very quick. Sandra Postel, Global Water Policy Project. So two things we've heard so much about today. It's cost, and then the benefits of cover cropping. And we've been hearing about how, the benefits are to some degree on farm. I mean, we've just heard a lot about increased water infiltration and water storage, reduced weeds, and so on. And then the external benefits, off farm to water quality, reduced dead zones, downstream, and so on. So I guess and yet we've heard, I think the Walton Family Foundation last study showed, 3% of our land is cover cropped, our cropland. So what kind of a public subsidy could be justified just because of the external benefits to cover cropping, reduced dead zone area and increased water quality? Has anyone done that research? Because the benefits seem so clear. From a water person's perspective, I've come to understand that cover cropping is one of the best things we could do for water storage on the land and water quality improvement. But I haven't seen a good sort of public subsidy figure for how we could expand the area that's cover cropped, particularly in the Midwest.
Well, I'll start with that one. Diana will want to comment. So one of the things that's been discussed is just in crop insurance, which we spend something roughly like $5 billion on, if that is providing, through conservation and cover crops, a reduction in risk because of better yield stability, then there's a return in investment to incentivize farmers through crop insurance to use those practices because there's a public good and that there would be less, in theory, less payout of crop insurance payments. But as far as the environmental ecosystem services, we just published through SARE a whole series of fact sheets on ecosystem services of various types. So if you just go to SARE, water quality and cover crops, Google that, you'll find those fact sheets on that. But Diana?
I think it's the way things get translated or don't get translated. You know, revolutions start not with the farmers. They basically know what they're doing to some extent or more extent. But I mentioned consumers. Agricultural revolution, the green revolution, all these revolutions started with consumers. And Bill was talking about ecosystem services. 15 years ago, USDA at NIFA, we went with EPA and did a $10 million ecosystem service grant funding project. And part of that was not only understanding ecosystem services, how that could be bundled in environmental practices at the farm level, but also policy, because policy drives this too, whether or not there's going to be payments, if it's public or private. But if the consumer understands there's a benefit of water quality or clean air or whatever, that combined with what the farmers and ranchers can do and be paid for that really is very powerful, and we just haven't gotten that synergy yet, but I think we're starting to get into a place that can happen again.
I think we have time for two more, one over here, and then we'll get you up front. So, yep.
I have a question. It sounds like the SARE grants primarily are focused on enabling the development and demonstration of innovative practices or the integration of a multiple set of practices. To what extent does SARE have the ability to fund new products, new tools, and new materials to have a beta test in an environment, and then subsequently those that are successful enable that entrepreneur to further develop and commercialize the tool, the material, the process?
Well, it's not a primary focus of SARE, but in our farmer rancher grants, we have funded quite a few product development efforts. I'm thinking, for example, of a robotic apple harvesting machine. There's been other processing ones, but really the strongest program in the USDA National Institutes of Food and Ag for that is the Small Business Innovation Research Grants program. There's both phase one, which are grants of, Diana, help me up, there's 100,000 you can go up to with those, and then phase two are larger grants.
250.
Yeah, so that's probably the best program for product development within the USDA. So let's go up here for the final question.
Thank you. Particularly in dryland agriculture, solarization is very widely utilized. But we do know that solarization is almost unanimous to soil sterilization. How should this be communicated to the growers as negative soil health?
Yeah, so Bianca, you want to take that one?
I think as soon as people understand that what drives the system is the biology, and that what we have is an ecosystem, and that what's down there is habitat and food, I think that gap then won't be as big. And that's really, in a lot of communication, you have to start with the why. You have to show somebody the very basics of why this thing that you're talking about is important, and the rest follows after that. And so I think really it's that initial paradigm shift that has to happen. You know, we have to go from this soil is a medium, it's a physical substance, it's got water and air in it, it grows my plants, to this is an ecosystem. It's alive, and it's the fact that it is alive that's making it function best for me that causes that resilience.
Well, I want to thank the panel for those great answers and for the presentations you have and for you for being a great audience. So thank you.